They thought publicly abandoning an Omega would destroy her forever. They thought Lyanna Ashford was something to be discarded, unworthy of love, too broken to matter. But they were wrong. Alpha King Theron Corvain didn't need a perfect queen.
My love,
He only needed the fated soul
And you
trying
are
to
my
disappear
soul.
into the shadows.
Forever by your side.
And tonight, in front of 1,000 wolves and the man who shattered her, he would make sure the entire world knew she belonged to him. The great hall of Iron Peak Summit smelled of cedar smoke and roasted venison. 1,000 predatory wolves filled the ancient stone chamber, their voices rising and falling like ocean waves against cliffs. Lyanna Ashford stood near a jagged pillar in the furthest corner, her thin fingers clutching a tray of empty goblets. The fur-lined cloak she wore was borrowed too large for her small frame, and it hung off her shoulders like a child playing dress-up in her parents' clothes. She kept her head down, always down. Her blonde hair was woven into tight, intricate braids that pulled at her scalp. The style was meant to keep her neat, invisible, forgettable. But tonight it felt like a crown of thorns, each strand a reminder of the girl she used to be before everything fell apart. Across the vast hall, past the roaring hearth and the tables laden with food she would never taste, Garrett. Driston laughed. The sound cut through the noise like a blade. His arm was draped around the shoulder of another alpha, their heads bent together in conversation about territories and trade routes. But it was the woman standing beside them who made Lyanna's chest tighten. Callista Sylvan. Tall, elegant, her lineage as pure as fresh mountain snow. Her wolf strong and unblemished. She wore a gown of silver silk that caught the firelight, and her dark hair cascaded in perfect waves over her shoulders. She was everything an alpha's mate should be. She was also the woman Garrett had chosen instead. Lyanna watched them for just a moment. One heartbeat. Two. The familiar ache bloomed in her chest, that hollow gnawing sensation of being not enough, not strong enough, not beautiful enough, not worthy, just not. She took a slow sip of bitter ale from a cup she'd found abandoned on a side table, praying the shadows would swallow her whole before anyone noticed the rejected Omega serving drinks to wolves who wouldn't even meet her eyes. But the shadows had never been kind to Lyanna Ashford. 3 months earlier, the Northern Ridge Pack had gathered under a blood-red moon. Lyanna remembered the cold, not the winter cold that bit at exposed skin, but the cold that came from 150 pairs of eyes watching her kneel in the dirt. The pack house loomed behind her, all rough-hewn timber and stone, the place she'd called home for 3 miserable years. Garrett stood on the raised platform, his chest bare, the traditional markings of an alpha painted across his skin in ash and wolf's blood. He was handsome in the way predators often were. Sharp jawline, broad shoulders, eyes the color of amber in sunlight. Those eyes had once looked at her with something that might have been affection. Now they held only disgust. I, Garrett Driston, Alpha of the Northern Ridge Pack, do hereby reject the bond with Lyanna Ashford. His voice carried over the assembled wolves, each word a hammer strike. She is weak of wolf, fractured of spirit, and unworthy to bear the airs of this pack. Lyanna's knees pressed into the frozen ground. Dirt and ice bit through the thin fabric of her dress. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand why 3 years of devotion meant nothing. But her wolf, that broken, whimpering thing inside her chest, only curled tighter into itself and made no sound at all. The pack said nothing. They never did. To speak against an alpha's rejection was to challenge his authority, and no one challenged Garrett Driston. She will remain, Garrett continued, pacing the platform like a wolf circling prey, as a servant to this pack. She will earn her keep through labor until such time as she proves herself useful or chooses to leave. Lyanna's fingers dug into the earth. Leave, as if she had anywhere to go. As if a rejected Omega with no family and no pack bonds could simply walk into the world and survive. Garrett descended the platform. He walked past her without a glance, his boots crunching over frozen ground. The pack erupted in a low murmur of acknowledgement, and Lyanna, still kneeling in the dirt, learned what it meant to be erased. The days after the rejection blurred together like watercolor left in the rain. Lyanna was given a room in the servants' quarters. Not a room, really. A closet with a cot and a single cracked window that let in the wind. Her belongings, what few she had, were thrown into a canvas sack and left outside the door. She worked from dawn until long past nightfall, scrubbing floors, hauling firewood, preparing meals she was not allowed to eat at the main table. The other servants pitied her at first, but pity faded quickly when Garrett made it clear that kindness toward Lyanna meant extra duties for everyone. So they stopped looking at her too. Lyanna learned to move like a ghost, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make herself so small and quiet that people forgot she was there. It was safer that way, easier. But there was one thing she couldn't make small: the scar. It sat just beneath her jawline, a thin, pale line that ached when the weather changed. Garrett had given it to her 6 months before the rejection during one of his discipline sessions. He called them training. Told her she needed to toughen up to stop being so fragile. He'd grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the wall of their shared room, his claws extending just enough to break skin. "You're pathetic," he'd snarled, his breath hot against her face. "How am I supposed to lead with a mate who can't even shift properly?" Liana's wolf had tried. She'd felt it clawing inside her chest, desperate to emerge to prove herself. But the shift never came. Just pain. Just the sensation of something vital breaking inside her over and over again. Garrett had let her go with a look of pure contempt. The wound healed, but the scar remained. A permanent reminder of her failure. 3 months of servitude taught Liana many things. She learned which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them. She learned that if she kept her eyes down and her mouth shut, the days passed faster. She learned to endure. But most importantly, she learned that survival was its own form of strength. The night before the Iron Peak summit, Garrett summoned her to the main hall. Liana went because she had no choice. Refusal meant punishment, and she'd learned that lesson well enough. Garrett sat in his high-backed chair going over documents with his lieutenants. He barely glanced up when she entered. "You'll accompany us to the summit," he said without preamble. "We need extra hands to serve. You'll keep your head down and your mouth shut." "Understood." Liana nodded. "I didn't hear you." "Understood, Alpha," she whispered. One of the lieutenants smirked but said nothing. They all knew what she was, the rejected Omega, the broken wolf, a cautionary tale about what happened when you weren't good enough. Liana's wolf whimpered, but Liana herself felt nothing. She'd learned to feel nothing. The journey to Iron Peak took 2 days by convoy. Liana rode in the back of a supply wagon wedged between crates of wine and bundles of furs. She didn't mind. It was quieter back here. Colder but quieter. The summit was a centuries-old tradition, a gathering of packs from across the northern territories to negotiate treaties, settle disputes, and forge alliances. It was also, Liana had heard, a place where alphas showed off their strength, their mates, their power. Garrett would be in his element. When they arrived, Iron Peak's fortress rose from the mountain like a sleeping giant. Black stone, iron gates, towers that seemed to scrape the sky. It was ancient and imposing, the kind of place that made you feel small just by existing near it. Liana was given her instructions by one of Garrett's lieutenants. Serve drinks, clear plates, stay out of sight. Easy enough. The great hall was already filling when she entered. Wolves from a dozen territories mingled beneath vaulted ceilings and flickering torchlight. The air smelled of smoke and meat and the musk of 1,000 predators, all pretending to be civil. Liana found her corner, her pillar, her shadow, and she watched as the powerful gathered, as alliances were made with handshakes and quiet words as the world turned without her. She watched and she felt the last fragile piece of her heart quietly finish breaking. Then the massive oak doors groaned open. The sound was like thunder rolling through stone. Every conversation in the great hall died mid-sentence. Every wolf from the lowest Omega to the most powerful Alpha turned toward the entrance. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to dim. The air didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Liana's breath caught in her throat. He walked like a king because he was one. Theron Corvainalpha, king of the Silver Crest, Dominion, moved through the hall with the kind of presence that demanded submission without a single word. He was massive, 6.5 feet of solid muscle and scarred skin, his broad shoulders wrapped in a black coat that looked like it cost more than Liana had earned in her entire life. But it was his face that made her hands tremble. A jagged scar cut across his left cheek, pale against sun-bronzed skin. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, was pulled back in a way that only made him look more dangerous. And his eyes, black, fathomless, predatory. They swept over the crowd with terrifying indifference as wolves dropped to their knees in waves, bowing before the king. Liana lowered her head on instinct, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Don't look at him," she told her wolf. "Stay invisible. Stay safe." But the boots didn't stop at the high table where Garrett and the other alphas waited, with carefully constructed smiles. They kept coming. Thud, thud, thud. The rhythmic strike of leather against stone grew louder. Closer, until a pair of black boots stopped directly in front of Liana's worn slippers. She stared at those boots, expensive leather, polished to a mirror shine, boots that had walked through blood and battle and never once faltered. The Alpha King didn't speak. He simply stood there, radiating heat in the freezing hall, a wall of power and presence that forced Liana to finally slowly lift her head. Theron Corvain looked down at her. and the world stopped. His eyes weren't just black, they were fathomless, like staring into the night sky and realizing how vast and terrifying the universe truly was. But there was something else there too. Something that made Liana's broken wolf stir for the first time in months. Recognition. "Your name," he commanded. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a low, vibrating growl that settled deep in Liana's bones and made her knees weak. Every wolf in the hall was watching. She could feel their eyes like brands on her skin. "Liana," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Liana Ashford, Your Majesty." Something flickered across the king's face. Not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, but close. He stepped into her personal space so close that she could smell him. Pine needles, smoke, old blood. The scent was overwhelming and intoxicating and utterly foreign. "You are shivering, Liana Ashford," Theron observed. It wasn't a question. Liana's hands trembled against the tray she was still somehow holding. "It's the draft, my lord." "There is no draft here." His hand rose large and calloused, hovering near her face. The entire hall held its breath. There is only a king who has been searching for his mate and a girl who thinks she can hide from him. Mate. The word detonated in Liana's chest like a bomb. No, that wasn't possible. She was broken, fractured, unworthy. Garrett had made that abundantly clear. The bond didn't work for her. Her wolf was too weak. But Theron's hand finally made contact, his thumb brushing over the scar hidden just beneath her jawline. The touch sent electricity racing down her spine, bright and silver and impossible to ignore. Her wolf didn't whimper. It howled. Theron tilted Liana's chin up with one finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes had shifted, no longer purely black, but threaded with veins of molten gold. "Who gave you this?" he asked quietly, his thumb tracing the scar. Liana couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, but Theron's gaze shifted, locking onto something over her shoulder. Number. Not something, someone. Garrett. The Northern Alpha stood frozen at the high table, his face pale, his amber eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Theron's lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was too sharp, too dangerous. A predator baring its teeth before the kill. He turned his attention back to Liana, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the great hall. "The summit is over for tonight." His hand slid from her chin to the small of her back, pulling her flush against his massive frame. "I have found what I came for." Liana gasped as her body collided with his. He was solid as stone and hot as a furnace, and the mate bond that she'd thought was broken, that she'd been told was worthless, sang between them like a plucked harp string. The hall erupted in whispers. But Theron ignored them all. He looked down at Liana, his expression softening just a fraction, and leaned close enough that only she could hear. "He's looking at you, Liana." Theron whispered, his breath hot against her skin. "He's realizing the girl he broke is the woman who will now rule over him. Give him something to remember." Before Liana could process the words, before she could think or question or run, Theron's hand moved to the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in her tight braids. He didn't ask permission. He claimed. Theron tilted her head back and crashed his lips onto hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was a declaration of war and a vow of protection all at once. His mouth was firm and demanding, tasting of whiskey and smoke, and something wild that made Liana's head spin. For one breathless second, her mind went blank. Every year of insecurity, every moment of being told she wasn't enough, every scar Garrett had left on her soul, all of it was scorched away by the sheer intensity of Theron Corvain's kiss. She felt her wolf, usually silent and cowering, throw its head back and howl in triumph. "Mine," it sang. "Ours. Finally." Liana's hands, which had been hanging uselessly at her sides, rose of their own accord. One touched Theron's chest, feeling the thunderous beat of his heart beneath expensive fabric. The other curled into his coat, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. Theron made a sound low in his throat, something between a growl and a groan, and deepened the kiss. His arm around her waist tightened until there was no space left between them. The great hall vanished. The whispers stopped. The world narrowed to this, the taste of him, the heat of him, the absolute certainty that something fundamental had just shifted in Liana's universe. When Theron finally pulled back, he didn't let her go. He kept his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes dark with possessive hunger. Then he turned his gaze one last time toward Garrett. The Northern Alpha stood frozen, his mouth agape, watching the woman he'd rejected being worshipped by a king. Theron's voice was a low, deadly purr that somehow carried through the silence. "Kiss me," he said to Liana, loud enough for Garrett to hear every syllable, "and he will see you're taken forever." Liana didn't hesitate. For the first time in 3 months, for the first time since Garrett had shattered her into pieces and told her she was worthless, Lyanna Ashford made a choice. She reached up her fingers, grazing the scar on Theron's cheek, and pulled him back down. This kiss was different, softer, slower. It tasted of salt and something that might have been tears, though Lyanna couldn't tell if they were hers or simply the emotion that seemed to pour off both of them in waves. Theron's hand came up to cup her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. His thumb brushed away the moisture on her cheek. When they finally broke apart, Lyanna was breathing hard, her lips swollen, her carefully constructed braids coming loose. And she didn't care. For the first time in her life, Lyanna Ashford wasn't looking for a place to hide. She had found a fortress. Theron's arm remained locked around her waist as he turned to address the hall. His voice was calm, absolute, the voice of a king who had never been questioned. "Let it be known," he said, "that Lyanna Ashford is under the protection of the Silvercrest throne. Any wolf who harms her, insults her, or questions her worth will answer to me personally." He let the words hang in the air for a beat. Then he looked directly at Garrett. That includes former bonds who were too blind to see the treasure in their hands. Garrett's face flushed deep red, a mixture of shame and impotent rage. Theron didn't wait for a response. He simply turned, keeping Lyanna tucked against his side, and began walking toward the massive oak doors. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Lyanna felt the weight of 1,000 stares, but for once they didn't make her want to disappear. Theron's presence was a shield, his arm around her waist and anchor. As they passed the high table, a voice rang out. Not Garrett's. Callista Sylvani stepped forward, her silver gown catching the firelight. "You can't be serious." Her voice was sharp-cutting. "She's nobody, a broken Omega. What could she possibly offer a king?" Theron stopped. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried with absolute clarity. "She offers me something none of you could ever provide." "And what's that?" Callista demanded. Theron looked down at Lyanna. His expression softened just for a moment, just enough for her to see the man beneath the crown. "Truth," he said simply. Then he kept walking, and Lyanna went with him, leaving behind the hall full of wolves who had watched her be discarded and were now watching her be claimed by the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. The cold night air hit them as soon as they stepped outside the great hall. Lyanna gasped at the shock of it, but Theron simply pulled her closer, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice gentler now that they were alone. Lyanna nodded, not trusting her voice. They crossed a cobblestone courtyard lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone. Theron's fortress loomed ahead, all black rock and iron gates, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like sanctuary. A pair of guards opened the gates without a word, bowing deeply as their king passed. Theron led Lyanna through a maze of corridors, past tapestries and suits of armor, and windows that showed glimpses of the mountain peaks beyond. Finally, he stopped in front of a heavy wooden door carved with wolves running beneath a full moon. "This is my private wing," Theron said. He pushed the door open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. "You'll be safe here." Lyanna stepped inside and nearly gasped. The room was enormous, lit by a gargantuan hearth that threw long, flickering shadows across walls lined with thousands of leather-bound books. It smelled of aged parchment and pine, and the windows looked out over jagged cliffs and endless sky. It was the most beautiful room Lyanna had ever seen. Theron closed the door behind them, and suddenly the reality of the situation crashed over Lyanna like a wave. She was alone, with the Alphaking, who had just kissed her in front of everyone and declared her his mate. Her mate. Lyanna's hands started to shake again. Theron noticed immediately. He moved to a sideboard and poured amber liquid into a heavy glass. He didn't approach her, just set the glass on a nearby table. "You're trembling again," he said. "I don't understand." Lyanna's voice came out small and broken. "Why me? Garrett was right about one thing. I have no lineage. I was a servant's daughter in his pack. I'm nobody." At the mention of Garrett's name, Theron's shoulders tensed. He turned, and the firelight caught the deep ridge of the scar on his cheek. He crossed the room in 3 predatory strides, stopping just inches from her. He didn't touch her, but the air between them crackled with energy. "Lineage is for those who need a paper trail to prove they matter," Theron growled. "I don't need a scroll to tell me what my soul recognized the moment I caught your scent." He paused, his gaze dropping to the scar beneath her jaw. "You are not nobody, Lyanna Ashford. You are the woman who looked at the Alphaking and didn't see a crown. You saw a man." Lyanna's breath hitched. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been watching you." Theron's admission was quiet but steady. "For 3 winters, I've seen you at the border markets, carrying burdens too heavy for your frame, helping pups who'd wandered too far from their mothers, mending clothes for wolves who never thanked you. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and cupped her cheek. I saw you, Liana, the real you. Not the broken Omega that bastard tried to convince you that you were. I saw your strength, your kindness, your refusal to let a world that treated you like nothing turn you cruel. Tears burned at the back of Liana's eyes. She'd spent 3 months learning not to cry, learning that tears were weakness, but Theron's words were undoing every wall she'd built. He hurt you. Theron continued, his thumb brushing over her scar. Not just with his words, but with the way he made you want to disappear. I saw you in that hall tonight trying to become a shadow. It's safer in the shadows, Liana whispered. Not anymore. Theron's voice was absolute. In this house, you are the light. He gestured to the room around them, to the books and the fire in the windows that showed the vast night sky. These books, this fire, this throne, it is all yours if you want it. But know this, Liana, I am a selfish man. I did not claim you tonight to play a political game. I claimed you because the wolf inside me will not breathe another breath without you by my side. Liana searched his eyes, looking for the lie, the strategy, the hidden motive. She found only something raw and honest, a loneliness that mirrored her own. For 3 years, she had been a discarded toy, a footnote in someone else's story. Now she was being offered a kingdom. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Theron's expression softened. A ghost of a smile touched his scarred face. Now you sleep, you eat, you read every word in this room if you wish. Tomorrow, when the sun rises over the peaks, the entire world will know that the king has a queen. And anyone who dares to look at you as less than will answer to me. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. You are home, Liana Ashford. Start believing it. Liana woke the next morning to the sound of crackling logs in the distant rhythmic ring of steel on steel. Morning light filtered through the high, narrow windows, casting long beams of gold across the library, where she had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on a velvet chaise lounge. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in an unfamiliar position, and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. The events of last night crashed over her like a wave. The summit, the kiss, Theron's declaration. Liana's fingers rose to her lips, still slightly swollen from where the Alphaking had claimed her in front of 1,000 witnesses. It felt like a dream, the kind of story servant girls whispered about in the kitchens, but never believed could be real. Yet here she was, wrapped in a soft blanket that smelled of pine and smoke, surrounded by more books than she'd ever seen in one place. A tray sat on the low table beside the chaise. Dark bread, honey that caught the morning light like liquid amber, mountain berries so ripe they looked ready to burst. Beside the food sat a single leather-bound volume smaller than the massive tomes lining the walls. Liana reached for it with trembling fingers. It was a collection of northern poetry, the kind her mother used to whisper to her on cold nights before everything fell apart. Before her mother died and left Liana alone in a world that had no place for orphaned Omega girls. A small piece of parchment was tucked inside the handwriting, bold and masculine. The shadows are gone, Liana. This room is yours until you are ready for the rest of the world. T. The gesture hit her harder than his public claim had. In the great hall, Theron had taken her by force of will, by the sheer dominance of an alpha who would not be denied. But here in the quiet morning light, he was giving her something far more valuable. Agency, choice, space to breathe. Liana's hands shook as she set the book down. She stood the blanket falling away and walked to the nearest shelf. Thousands of books climbed the walls, their spines cracked with age and use. Philosophy, history, poetry, battle strategy, medical texts, everything a mind could hunger for, all here, all waiting. She reached for a heavy tome on the top shelf, something about the lineage of the northern Pax, and heard a footfall behind her. Liana spun, her heart leaping into her throat. A woman stood in the doorway. She was older, perhaps 60 winters, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes were the sharp, intelligent gray of a seasoned warrior, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in this fortress through decades of service. I am Vera, the woman said, her voice neutral but not unkind. The king's master of the house. He told me you might find your way here. He said the library would be the first place you'd feel safe. Liana lowered her hand from the shelf, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. He knows me better than I know myself, it seems. He has watched you for a long time, Liana Ashford. Vera stepped into the room, her footsteps barely making a sound on the thick carpet. Long before last night, he saw you at the borders. He saw you in the villages. He waited until you were free of that boy Garrett to make his move. The revelation sent a jolt through Liana's chest. Theron hadn't just stumbled upon her at the summit. He had been observing her, waiting, planning. I don't have the blood of a Queen Vera, Liana whispered, looking down at her hands. They were rough from years of work, the nails broken and uneven. I'm just a woman who knows how to mend clothes and keep quiet. Vera crossed the room with surprising speed for her age. She placed a firm hand on Liana's shoulder, her grip strong and grounding. A queen is not made of blood, child. She is made of the strength it takes to survive when the world wants to crush you. Vera's gray eyes bore into Liana's with an intensity that left no room for argument. You have survived, Garrett. You have survived being alone. Now you must survive being loved by a king who would burn this mountain down if you asked him to. Liana opened her mouth to protest, to say that she wasn't strong, that surviving wasn't the same as thriving, but Vera was already moving toward the far wall. Come, the older woman said. Let me show you something. Vera led Liana to a large arched window that looked out over the training grounds below. The view stole Liana's breath. The courtyard was a sea of packed earth and weapon racks surrounded by high stone walls. Warriors moved through drills with practiced precision, their movements a deadly dance of blade and body. But Liana only had eyes for one. Theron was stripped to the waist despite the mountain chill, his skin glistening with sweat in the pale morning light. Every muscle in his back and shoulders was defined like carved marble, moving beneath tanned skin marked with old scars. He moved with brutal, efficient grace, his sword a blur of silver as he sparred with 3 opponents at once. They were good, fast and strong, but Theron was better. He disarmed the first with a twist of his wrist, sent the second sprawling with a sweeping kick, and pressed the edge of his blade to the third's throat before any of them could blink. The watching warriors erupted in cheers. Theron stepped back, lowering his sword. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his chest heaving from exertion. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked up. His dark eyes locked onto Liana through the glass. The world narrowed to that single point of connection. Liana's breath caught in her throat. She should look away, should step back from the window. But she couldn't move. Theron didn't wave, didn't smile. He simply raised his sword in a silent salute, a promise made in steel and sweat and the kind of certainty that didn't require words. Liana's hand pressed against the cold glass of its own accord, and she realized with the clarity that shook her to her core that this fortress wasn't a prison to keep her in. It was a shield to keep the world out until she was strong enough to face it at his side. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Liana had never known before. She woke each morning to find a tray of food waiting. Fresh bread, honey, sometimes fruit or cheese, always accompanied by a note in Theron's bold handwriting. Never long, never flowery. Just simple observations that made her feel seen. You were reading until past midnight. Don't forget to sleep. The blue book on the third shelf is my favorite. I think you'll like it too. You smiled yesterday when you thought no one was watching. Do it more often. Liana devoured the books like a woman starving. Philosophy texts that challenged everything she thought she knew about pack dynamics. Poetry that made her chest ache with beauty. Medical journals that taught her about healing herbs and bone-setting techniques she'd never encountered before. She was learning, growing, becoming something more than the broken Omega Garrett had tried to convince her she was. Theron kept his distance during the day. He had a kingdom to run treaties, to negotiate warriors to train, but Liana always knew where he was. The mate bond still incomplete, but growing stronger every day hummed in her chest like a living thing. It pulled her attention toward him even when he was rooms away. In the evenings, he came to the library. He never asked permission, never announced himself. He would simply appear in the doorway, still dressed in training leathers or formal attire from whatever meeting had occupied his afternoon, and settle into the chair across from hers by the fire. Sometimes they talked. Theron told her about his childhood, about becoming king at 16 when his father fell in battle, about the weight of leadership, about watching wolves bow before a crown while never seeing the man beneath it. Liana told him about her mother, about learning to read from stolen books, about the small kindnesses she'd witnessed that had kept her believing in goodness even when the world was cruel. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, both reading, the only sound the crackling fire and the occasional turn of a page. It was on the third night, while Liana was curled in her favorite chair with a book about ancient pack lore, that the electric touch happened. Theron reached across the space between them to hand her a cup of tea he'd poured from the pot Vera always left warming by the hearth. Their fingers brushed. The world exploded in the silver light. Liana gasped as electricity raced up her arm, bright and hot and utterly impossible to ignore. It wasn't painful, it was the opposite. Like every nerve ending in her body had suddenly woken up and remembered what it meant to feel truly alive. Theron's eyes flashed gold. The cup fell from both their hands, forgotten, as the mate bond roared to life between them. Liana felt it settle deeper into her bones, a tether that connected her soul to his in a way that transcended words or reason. She could feel his emotions, not clearly, not like reading his thoughts, but as impressions. Hunger, longing, a fierce protective need that made her wolf keen with recognition. Theron, Liana whispered. He was on his knees in front of her chair before she could blink, his large hands cradling her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. Do you feel it? His voice was rough, barely controlled. The bond, it's waking up. Liana nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands rose to cover his, holding them against her cheeks. Everyone wants the king, Theron said, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. They want the protection of my strength, the power of my throne, the glory of my victories. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. But you don't want those things, do you? Liana's heart cracked open. She moved without thinking, sliding from the chair to kneel on the floor with him. They were eye level now, face-to-face breath, mingling in the firelit space between them. I see you, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. I see a man who leaves me books he thinks I'll love, who trains until his hands bleed because he's terrified of failing his people, who pretends he doesn't notice when I'm scared, but always makes sure there's a fire burning before I wake. She touched the scar on his cheek, that pale ridge she'd traced in her dreams. I see you, Theron, and you're more than enough. The sound he made was somewhere between a growl and a broken exhale. His hands slid from her face to her waist, pulling her close until there was no space left between them. You're healing me, he whispered against her hair. You don't even know it, but every moment you spend in this fortress, every smile you try to hide, every book you read like it's a gift instead of a burden, you're putting pieces back together I didn't even know were broken. Liana wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. Just held on. Two souls finding shelter in each other. Outside the window, the sun had begun to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the library in shades of bruised purple and deep orange. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Liana felt like she had a home, not a place, a person. On the morning of the 5th day, Liana woke to raised voices echoing through the stone corridors. She dressed quickly and in one of the simple gowns Vera had left in the wardrobe, deep forest green, that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and ventured out of the library. The voices grew louder as she descended the main staircase. Cannot be serious, Your Majesty. She has no training, no lineage, no... Careful. Theron's voice cut through the protest like a blade. Very careful how you finish that sentence, counselor. Liana rounded the corner and froze. The Great Hall was filled with people. Members of the High Council, their formal robes marking them as alphas and elders from across the territories. And at the center, looking like a goddess carved from ice and malice, stood Callista Sylvan. Her dark hair cascaded in perfect waves over a gown of silver silk. Her beauty was the kind that demanded attention, sharp and cold, and utterly aware of its own power. Callista's eyes locked onto Liana, and her perfect lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Speak of the wolf, Callista said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. So this is the miracle that stopped the summit. She glided forward, climbing the first few steps of the staircase, forcing Liana to either retreat or stand her ground. Liana stopped where she was. Callista looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that was meant to make its target feel small. Inadequate. Less than. You certainly have a quiet look about you, Callista continued. Though in the royal court, quiet is usually just a synonym for useless. The women behind her tittered. The sound was like broken glass, raw, sharp, and cutting. Liana felt the familiar cold lump of insecurity rise in her throat. Her instinct was to apologize, to step aside, to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. But then she felt the weight of Theron's presence in the pod, and that steady golden warmth that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. And in her pocket, her fingers found the small leather bookmark he'd left in the poetry collection, a tangible reminder that she had value beyond what these wolves thought. The king values peace, Liana said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Perhaps that is why he finds quietness so appealing. Callista's smile didn't falter, but something cold flashed in her eyes. She stepped closer, invading Liana's space. Listen closely, little rabbit. Callista's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow still carried through the hall. The Alphaking is a creature of war. He is currently infatuated with your novelty, but novelty wears thin. He needs a queen who can lead armies, who understands the blood debts of the clans. She leaned in, her breath hot against Liana's ear. He needs a lioness, not a stray. I have been groomed for this role since birth. My bloodline is impeccable. My wolf is strong, And when he realizes what he truly needs, I will be waiting. Lyanna looked past Callista to the faces of the council. They were watching her like vultures, waiting for her to crumble, to prove that she was exactly what they thought, a temporary distraction for a king who would eventually come to his senses. For 3 months, Lyanna had let people like this define her worth. She looked at the scars on her own hands. Not scars of battle, but scars of survival, of scrubbing floors and hauling firewood, and enduring a world that told her she was nothing, and still waking up the next morning to face another day. Those were warrior scars too. Lyanna took a step down the stairs, putting herself on the same level as Callista. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She spoke with the terrifyingly calm authority she had seen Theron use when his word was law. The king has spent his entire life surrounded by lions, Lyanna said. He knows exactly what they look like. He knows they are opportunistic. He knows they bite when his back is turned. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing. He didn't choose me because I can lead an army. He chose me because I am the only person in this kingdom who isn't trying to take something from him. If you want to challenge his choice, I suggest you wait until he returns. Lyanna straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried to every corner of the hall. But be warned, Theron doesn't like it when people touch his things, and he has made it very clear that I am his. The use of the king's given name spoken with such familiarity sent a shockwave through the assembled wolves. Callista recoiled, as if stung, her perfect composure cracking for just a moment. How dare you? How dare I what? The voice boomed from the far entrance, vibrating through stone and bone. Theron stood in the archway, his cloak still dusted with snow from whatever border he'd been inspecting. His eyes flashed that dangerous molten gold that meant his wolf was very close to the surface. He walked toward them, and the air in the hall grew heavy with alpha command. The council members lowered their heads, instinct forcing submission, even from those who moments ago had been questioning his judgment. Theron didn't look at them. He walked straight to Lyanna and draped a heavy possessive arm over her shoulders, pulling her against his side. I heard my name, Theron growled, his gaze settling on Callista. And I heard my mate defending her right to be here. I find myself wondering why my counsel is bothering a woman who has more courage in her silence than you have in your entire lineage. Callista bowed her head, but not before Lyanna saw the fury burning in her eyes. We were only testing her mettle, my lord. She has been tested by life, Callista. Theron said, his grip tightening on Lyanna. She doesn't need to be tested by you. Now leave, all of you, before I forget that some of your fathers are friends of the throne. The council didn't need to be told twice. They filed out in tense silence, Callista leading them with her head high and her jaw clenched tight. As the last of them disappeared through the doors, Theron turned Lyanna toward him. He looked at her with a new kind of heat. Not just the hunger of a mate, but the pride of a king who had seen his queen find her crown. You stood your ground, he said quietly. I realized she couldn't take anything from me that I didn't give her, Lyanna replied. And I'm tired of giving my power away. Theron's gaze darkened, the gold in his eyes swirling like a storm. The mate bond, which had been a low-level ache in Lyanna's chest for days, suddenly flared into a roaring fire. It was more than physical attraction. It was soul-deep recognition, a tether that was tightening with every second they remained in each other's space. The bond, Theron murmured, his nose brushing against hers. Can you feel it demanding completion? Lyanna nodded, unable to find her voice. It felt as if 1,000 invisible threads were connecting every nerve ending in her body to his. The scars on her hands tingled. The ache in her heart began to dissolve. Theron's hands moved from her shoulders to her waist. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her not toward the library, but toward a smaller chamber off the main hall. An oak table dominated the space covered in maps and documents. He swept them aside with one arm and set Lyanna on the edge. He stepped between her knees, his presence a wall of heat and safety and barely restrained need. I told you I was a selfish man, Theron said, his voice dropping to a rasp. I want everything, Lyanna. I want the whispers and the quiet moments in the library, and I want the fire. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. I want to mark you so deeply that even the stars know you belong to the king. Lyanna's hands rose to tangle in the hair at the nape of his neck. The bond was screaming now, demanding the bite that would begin to seal them together. Then mark me, she whispered. I don't want to be a shadow anymore. I want to be yours. The confession was the final trigger. Theron let out a low, possessive growl and buried his face in the crook of her neck. His lips traced the sensitive skin right above her collarbone, the exact spot where the mate mark would bloom. Lyanna arched her back, a sob of relief escaping her throat. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being used. She was being claimed. She wasn't a choice made out of convenience. She was a destiny made of blood and bone. Theron's teeth grazed her skin, elongating slightly, preparing for the bite that would begin the bonding ceremony. Lyanna felt tears streaming down her face. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming rightness of this moment. This man, this bond. Lyanna, Theron breathed against her skin. Once I do this, there's no going back. The bonding ceremony begins now, but it won't be complete until we faced our first trial together. You'll be tied to me, to my throne, to everything that comes with being queen. I know, she whispered. I choose it. I choose you. Theron's control shattered. His teeth sank into her flesh. The world exploded in white light and silver fire. Lyanna screamed, but not from pain. From the sheer overwhelming sensation of their souls beginning to merge. She felt him flooding into her consciousness. His strength, his determination, his desperate need for someone who saw him as more than a weapon or a throne. And she felt him absorbing her pain, her insignificance, her years of being told she was worthless. He took it all and began replacing it with his mountainous strength, his unshakable certainty. The bond snapped partially into place, like the first lock clicking in a complex mechanism. Theron pulled back his eyes, pure molten gold, his lips stained with her blood. The mark on Lyanna's neck glowed silver in the dim light, a perfect circle of teeth marks that would never fully fade. She was his. He was hers. But the bond was incomplete. It would take a shared trial, a test of their partnership, to fully seal them together. Theron crushed his mouth to hers, and this kiss was nothing like the one in the Great Hall. This was raw, desperate, a claiming and a surrender all at once. Lyanna kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer even though there was no space left between them. They were lost in each other, the world narrowing to sensation and emotion, and the bond singing between them like struck lightning. Which is why neither of them heard the footsteps until it was too late. The door slammed open with a crash that echoed through the chamber. "Sire!" Theron snarled, a sound of pure primal fury at being interrupted. His eyes were still gold when he turned toward the intruder, his body positioned protectively in front of Lyanna. One of his captains stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his face pale with urgency. "What?" Theron's voice was barely human. "Border attack, Your Majesty. Garrett Driston's pack has allied with rogue wolves. They're moving toward the eastern territories. If we don't respond now, they'll breach the inner defenses by nightfall." The words were like ice water on fire. Theron closed his eyes, his jaw clenching so hard Lyanna heard his teeth grind. Through the bond, she felt his conflict, the desperate need to stay with her, warring against his duty to his kingdom. "How many?" Theron asked, his voice regaining its steel. 200 rogues. Maybe more." Theron turned back to Lyanna. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her swollen lips. "I have to go," he said, and the anguish in his voice was a physical thing. "I know." Lyanna covered his hands with hers. "Go. Protect them. The bond will be here when you get back." Lyanna managed a small smile despite the aching emptiness that was already forming in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere." Theron kissed her one more time, hard and fast and full of unspoken promises. Then he was gone, bellowing orders as he strode from the chamber, transforming from her mate back into the Alphaking, who held a kingdom together through sheer force of will. Lyanna sat alone on the oak table, her hand pressed to the fresh mate mark on her neck. The bond pulsed in her chest, begun, but incomplete. There were rituals, trials, things that needed to happen to fully seal them together. But Garrett had made his move, and Lyanna had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. 2 weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Theron had been gone for 13 days, leading his forces against Garrett's alliance of rogues and discontented packs. The bond thrummed in Lyanna's chest day and night, a constant connection that let her feel echoes of his presence. Distance, determination, flashes of battle heat and cold focus, and worry. Always worry threading back to her. Lyanna hadn't been idle. The fortress needed her in ways she'd never imagined. With Theron gone and many of the warriors deployed, Vera had put Lyanna to work. Not as a servant this time, but as someone with skills the fortress desperately needed. The healing ward became her second home. She worked alongside the healers, her hands steady as she cleaned wounds and mixed poultices from the recipes she'd memorized from Theron's medical texts. Warriors who'd returned from skirmishes looked at her with respect instead of pity. The king's mate, who didn't flinch at blood, who worked until her hands ached and never complained. Word spread through the fortress. The quiet Omega from the summit wasn't so quiet anymore. But Garrett's attack had been more than simple border raids. It had been calculated, coordinated, as if he'd been planning it for months, not weeks, as if he'd known exactly when to strike. Liana was in the healing ward on the 14th day wrapping a warrior's broken ribs when Vera appeared in the doorway. The older woman's face was grim. "We need supplies from the armory. Silver blades need to be counted and distributed. The king's orders before he left." Liana followed Vera up narrow stairs to a wing of the fortress she hadn't explored. The armory was a cathedral of violence. Weapons lined the walls in careful rows. Swords, spears, bows. Everything a kingdom needed to defend itself against those who would tear it down. At the center of the room sat an altar. It was ancient, carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface covered in symbols Liana didn't recognize. They seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, silver lines against darkness. "Don't touch that," Vera said sharply, but she was already moving toward the far wall where the silver weapons were stored. Liana stepped closer to the altar anyway. Something about it called to her, a pull she couldn't explain. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift when she looked at them, directly settling back into stillness when she glanced away. "What is it?" she asked. "Old magic." Vera didn't turn around. "From before the clan split, before the wars. Some say it can reveal bloodlines, test lineage. The king's father used it once to settle a succession dispute." Liana reached out her fingers, hovering over the surface. "I said don't," but Liana's hand was already moving. She touched one of the silver symbols, tracing its curved shape. The edge was sharper than it looked. Blood welled from her fingertip, 3 drops falling onto the altar's black surface before she could pull back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world exploded in violet light. Liana stumbled backward, crying out as the altar blazed like a captured star. The symbols didn't just glow, they burned, racing across the surface in patterns that made her eyes water. Vera grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away, but Liana couldn't move. She was frozen, transfixed by the light that was now rising from the altar, like smoke coalescing into shapes. Images. A woman with silver hair and violet eyes, heavily pregnant, standing before this same altar. She was whispering something, her hands pressed to her swollen belly. A spell, a prayer, a desperate act of protection. The vision shifted, the same woman, older now, placing a newborn infant on the altar. Her tears fell onto the baby's forehead as she spoke words in a language Liana had never heard but somehow understood. "Hide her. Keep her safe. Let the world forget what she is until she's strong enough to remember." Silver light poured from the woman's hands, sinking into the infant's skin. Sealing, binding, locking away something vast and terrible and beautiful. The infant's eyes flashed violet before fading to ordinary hazel. The vision shattered. Liana collapsed to her knees, gasping. Her entire body felt like it was on fire from the inside out. The mate mark on her neck blazed hot enough to burn. Vera knelt beside her, her face pale as death. "By the old gods," the older woman whispered. "You're not broken at all." Liana looked up, tears streaming down her face. "What did I just see?" "Your mother." Vera's hands shook as she helped Liana to her feet. "That was your mother sealing your bloodline." "I don't understand. You're not a fractured Omega child. You never were." Vera gripped Liana's shoulders hard enough to bruise. "You're descended from the sovereign moon line, the first wolves, the ones who could command Alpha and Omega alike. Your mother hid what you were to protect you from those who would use or destroy such power." The words didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. Liana was nobody. A servant's daughter. A rejected mate. But the altar was still glowing violet, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. And when Liana looked down at her hands, she saw them. Faint silver lines tracing beneath her skin, like veins of light already starting to fade. "The seal is breaking," Vera said urgently. "Your bond with the king, it's destabilizing the magic your mother wove. You're waking up." Before Liana could respond, before she could process what any of this meant, the door to the armory crashed open. 2 figures stood silhouetted in the doorway. Callista and Garrett. Liana's wolf, which had been stirring restlessly since the altar vision, suddenly went very still. Danger. Garrett looked different than she remembered. Thinner, harder. His amber eyes burned with something that went beyond anger into the territory of obsession. He held a silver blade, and behind him, Callista's perfect face was twisted with vindictive pleasure. "Well, well," Garrett said, his voice like gravel. "The broken Omega who became queen. I have to admit, Liana, I didn't think you had it in you." Vera stepped in front of Liana, her stance protective despite her age. "The king will tear you apart for this intrusion. The king is conveniently occupied with my rogue allies." Garrett's smile was all teeth. "I've been planning this since the night of the summit. The attack, the alliance, all of it designed to draw him away long enough for me to reclaim what's rightfully mine." "I was never yours to steal," Liana said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. You rejected her, Vera snapped. Publicly. You have no claim. I made a mistake. Garrett took a step forward, and Liana saw the madness dancing in his eyes. I rejected a sovereign heir. Do you know what that means? The power I could have wielded, the territories that would have bent the knee. He laughed, a sound devoid of sanity. And instead I threw you away because your mother's seal made you look weak. But I see you now, I know what you are, and I'm taking back what should have been mine from the start. Callista stepped forward, her silver dress pristine despite the dust of travel. This is where we part ways, Garrett. You can have your revenge, but the girl dies. I won't risk her living and taking the throne that should be mine. Garrett's expression flickered. We had a deal. I get Liana, you get the throne once Theron is dead, yes. Callista's voice was cold as winter death. She pulled a vial of clear liquid from her bodice. But I'm not stupid enough to let a sovereign bloodline live. She'll be too powerful, too dangerous. Better she dies now, and you can blame it on whatever you like. Understanding crashed over Liana. This wasn't about love or revenge or even power. This was about elimination. Callista wanted Theron for herself, and Liana was the only obstacle. Garrett lunged. Vera tried to block him, but Garrett backhanded the older woman with casual cruelty. She hit the floor hard, crying out in pain. Liana moved without thinking, putting herself between Garrett and Vera. But she had no weapons, no training, just rage and a wolf that was suddenly screaming inside her chest to fight. Garrett grabbed her by the throat, his claws extending to prick her skin. I'm going to enjoy watching Theron's face when he finds out I took you right from under his nose. Garrett hissed. I'm going to force bond with you in the old ruins, and there's nothing that bastard king can do about it. You'll be mine, Liana. Forever. She'll never belong to anyone. Callista stepped forward, uncorking the vial. Because she won't survive the next 5 minutes. Before Garrett could react, Callista threw the contents of the vial in Liana's face. The world went black. Liana woke to the smell of old stone and rotting wood. Pain lanced through her skull, sharp and insistent. Her hands were bound above her head, silver chains biting into her wrists. The metal burned, sending waves of nausea through her body. She forced her eyes open. The old ruins, an ancient temple to the moon goddess abandoned centuries ago after some long-forgotten war. Now it was just broken pillars and crumbling walls, a monument to faded glory. And apparently the perfect place for a kidnapping. Garrett sat on a fallen stone, sharpening his blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Callista stood near what might have once been an altar, examining her nails with practiced disinterest. She's awake, Callista said without turning around. Garrett looked up, and his smile was the cruelest thing Liana had ever seen. Good, I want you conscious for this, Liana. I want you to understand exactly what you lost when you chose that king over me. Liana tested the chains. They held fast, the silver burning deeper with every movement. Through the bond, she could feel Theron. He was far away, still engaged in battle, but something had changed. Alarm, fury. He knew something was wrong. He was coming. But would he be fast enough? You told me I was worthless, Liana said, her voice hoarse but steady. You made me believe that my wolf was fractured, that I deserved to be rejected. Garrett couldn't meet her eyes. But I'm not worthless, Garrett. I never was. You were just too small to see it. Enough talking. Callista turned, a silver dagger glinting in her hand. I have a kingdom to inherit, and you're in my way. She walked toward Liana with predatory grace. Garrett can play with your corpse all he wants, but you're dying tonight. Garrett stood uncertain. We agreed I would help you take her from Theron. I never agreed to let her live. Callista raised the dagger. Goodbye, little Omega. I'll take good care of your king. She stepped close to Liana, raising the dagger toward her exposed throat. And Liana, who had spent 3 months learning to endure pain, who had survived rejection and humiliation, and years of being told she was worthless, felt something inside her chest finally catastrophically shatter. Not break, shatter. The seal her mother had woven, so carefully designed to hide a bloodline, too powerful for a child to control, splintered like glass. Violet light exploded from Liana's skin. The silver chains holding her arms snapped like thread. Garrett and Callista were thrown backward by the force of the energy, crashing into the ruined walls. Liana's eyes blazed pure violet. And for the first time in her life, she felt her wolf fully emerge. The shift was agony and ecstasy all at once. Bones broke and reformed. Muscles tore and regrew. Her body stretched and changed, fur erupting from skin that had never known its true form. When the transformation completed, a silver wolf the size of a small horse stood where Liana had been kneeling. Not gray, not white. Pure silver like captured moonlight, with eyes that burned violet fire. The sovereign moon bloodline awakened at last. Garrett scrambled backward, his face pale with shock. That's impossible. Sovereign wolves are extinct. They were hunted to extinction 300 years ago because they were too powerful to control. The silver wolf's lips pulled back in a snarl that promised death. Callista screamed, raising her dagger, but the wolf was faster. Lyanna launched herself forward, her jaws closing around Callista's wrist. The woman shrieked as the dagger fell from nerveless fingers. Lyanna threw her aside, not killing, but removing the threat, and turned her attention to Garrett. The man who had rejected her, hurt her, made her believe she was broken. She stalked toward him, and Garrett did something Lyanna had never seen him do in 3 years. He cowered. Lyanna, wait, he stammered, backing into a corner. We can talk about this. I made a mistake. I see that now. We can... The silver wolf lunged, but before she could reach him, another wolf crashed into the clearing, black as midnight with eyes of molten gold. Theron. He was massive, bigger than any alpha Lyanna had ever seen, but she was bigger. The sovereign bloodline had made her larger than even the Alpha King. Through the bond, Lyanna felt his shock, his awe, his fierce pride, and beneath it all, his absolute rage at those who had threatened his mate. They circled Garrett together, two predators united in purpose. Garrett pulled a sword from his belt, silver-edged and deadly. He swung at Theron, the blade slicing across the black wolf's shoulder. Theron barely flinched. Lyanna hit Garrett from the side, her claws raking across his chest. He screamed, stumbling, and Theron was there to meet him. The black wolf's jaws closed around Garrett's sword arm, crushing bone. The sword fell. Garrett collapsed to his knees, bleeding from a dozen wounds. His amber eyes were wide with terror as he looked up at the two wolves standing over him. Mercy, he gasped. Please, I'll leave. You'll never see me again. Just please. Theron shifted back to human form, standing naked and blood-covered in the ruins. His expression was utterly without mercy. You touched my mate, Theron said quietly. You hurt her, threatened her, tried to steal her from me. He leaned down, grabbing Garrett by the throat. There is no mercy for that. Theron, wait. The voice was Lyanna's, but it came from the silver wolf. She shifted back, the transformation smoother this time, and stood on shaking legs. She was covered in dirt and blood, her clothes in tatters, but her eyes were clear. She walked to where Garrett knelt, broken and bleeding, and looked down at him. You told me I was worthless, she said softly. You made me believe that my wolf was fractured, that I deserved to be rejected. Garrett couldn't meet her eyes. But I'm not worthless, Garrett. I never was. You were just too small to see it. She turned to Theron. Don't kill him. Theron's expression was incredulous. Lyanna. Death is too quick. Lyanna's violet eyes held no forgiveness. I want him to live. I want him to go back to his pack and tell them what he saw. I want every wolf in the Northern Territories to know that he rejected the sovereign heir, that he had a queen and threw her away. Understanding dawned in Theron's eyes. He smiled, and it was sharp and vicious and absolutely beautiful. As you wish, my queen. Theron hauled Garrett to his feet and spoke directly into his face. You will live, Garrett Adriston. You will return to your pack and watch from a distance as the woman you rejected rises to power you'll never touch. Every time you see a coin with our faces on it, every time you hear of the Silver Queen and her king, you will remember. He shoved Garrett toward the entrance. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind. Garrett stumbled away into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Callista tried to follow, but Theron's hand shot out, grabbing her by the arm. You, he said coldly, orchestrated an attack on my kingdom and aided in kidnapping my mate. Your punishment will be decided by the council. But know this, you will never set foot in my territory again. Callista's perfect composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as guards who had followed Theron dragged her away, and then they were alone. Theron and Lyanna stood in the ruins, both covered in blood and dirt, both breathing hard from the battle and the shift and the sheer adrenaline of survival. Through the ponomus, Lyanna felt everything he was feeling. Relief so profound it was almost painful. Pride that threatened to overflow, and beneath it all, love so fierce it burned. You're magnificent, Theron whispered. Then he was kissing her. Not the public claim in the Great Hall, not the desperate marking in the fortress. This was something deeper. Soul-deep devotion. Recognition not just of mate, but of equal. Lyanna kissed him back with everything she had, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding him close as if she could merge them into a single being. The mate mark on her neck blazed bright, and the bond that had been partially sealed for 2 weeks suddenly finally clicked fully into place. Violet and gold light exploded around them, magic responding to magic bloodline, recognizing bloodline. They had faced their trial together, fought as equals, survived as partners. And the bond recognizing this truth completed itself. The bond snapped into place with such force that both of them cried out, collapsing to their knees together, still holding each other. Lyanna felt Theron flood into her consciousness. Not just emotions now, but thoughts, memories. His childhood terror of failing his people. His years standing alone at the summit of power. The moment he first saw her at the border market and knew she was his. And he felt her pain, her survival, her quiet strength that had endured when a weaker soul would have shattered. They were one soul in two bodies connected by bonds no force could break. When the light faded, they stayed on their knees, foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync. "I love you," Lyanna whispered. "I didn't know I could feel this much and not break apart." "You won't break," Theron promised. "Never again, because I'll be here to catch every piece if you fall." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, now returned to their normal hazel with just a hint of violet shimmer. "And you'll do the same for me." Lyanna nodded, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of coming home. Theron stood pulling her up with him. He wrapped his cloak around her bare shoulders, and together they walked out of the ruins. Behind them, the old temple stood silent, a monument to faded glory where a new queen had been born from the ashes of who she used to be. And ahead, a kingdom waited to kneel before the sovereign heir and the king who loved her. 3 days later, the great hall of Iron Peak was filled once more. But this time it wasn't for a summit, it was for a coronation. Lyanna stood before the assembled wolves wearing a gown of silver and violet that Vera had commissioned from the finest tailors in the territory. Her blonde hair, no longer in tight braids, fell in loose waves over her shoulders. The mate mark on her neck was visible to all, glowing faintly silver. Theron stood beside her, his hand in hers, wearing the formal regalia of the Alphaking. The High Council knelt before them, the warriors of Silver Crest, the representatives from every pack in the Northern Territories. And in the very back, barely visible, Garrett Driston stood with his few remaining loyalists. His face was a mask of barely suppressed rage and shame. An elder stepped forward, carrying a crown forged of silver and moonstone. It caught the light like captured stars. "Lyanna Ashford Corvain," the elder intoned, "by blood and bond, by trial and triumph, do you accept the crown of the Silver Crest Dominion? Do you vow to protect this kingdom and its people with all that you are?" Lyanna's voice rang clear and strong through the hall. "I do." The crown settled on her head, and the assembled wolves erupted in a thunderous howl of acknowledgement. "Long live the queen! Long live the sovereign!" Theron turned to her, his eyes shining with pride and love. He leaned in, whispering for her ears only, "You were the girl who wasn't enough. Now you're the woman who is everything." Then he kissed her before the entire kingdom, and the crowd roared their approval. 6 months later, winter had given way to spring. Lyanna stood on the balcony of the fortress library, one hand resting on the swell of her pregnant belly. "Twins," the healer said. "A boy and a girl, both carrying the silver shimmer of the sovereign line." Theron came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his hands covering hers on her stomach. "They're restless today," Lyanna said, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her palms. "They take after their mother." Theron's voice was warm with affection. Strong, stubborn, absolutely unwilling to be ignored. Lyanna leaned back against his chest, watching the kingdom spread out below them. Peaceful, thriving, home. In the distance, she could see the training grounds where new warriors practiced, the villages where children played without fear, the borders that had held against all threats. This was what they had built together. Not just a kingdom, but a future. "Do you ever think about that night at the summit?" Lyanna asked. "Every day." Theron pressed a kiss to her temple. "The moment I saw you trying to disappear into the shadows, I knew. My soul recognized yours before my mind could catch up. I thought I was broken." "You were never broken, Lyanna. You were hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Lyanna turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had claimed her when she felt worthless, who had stood beside her as an equal when the world tried to make her small. "I love you," she said. The words came easier now after 6 months of saying them every day. "I love you too." Theron's hand came up to cup her cheek. "My queen, my mate, my home." Far below in the courtyard, a group of children played. One of them, a little girl with blonde hair, looked up at the balcony and waved. Lyanna waved back, smiling. She had been the rejected Omega, the broken wolf, the girl who wasn't enough. Now she was the Silver Queen, the sovereign heir, the woman who had risen from the ashes of rejection to become something no one, not even herself, had imagined possible. And she had done it not by changing who she was, but by finally becoming who she had always been meant to be.